Summer. Just saying the word made Pat smile as he filled his duffel bag haphazardly with everything casual. His parents were in Europe, his sister was at their side, and a 3.8 grade point average for the year meant no summer school. All in all, it left him totally free for the next 3 months, and he felt like it. Pat had $1,000 in traveler's checks from Dad for those grades, 2 of his gas credit cards, his mother's ATM for emergencies only, she noted, and, best of all, his sister's car. Not exactly perfect because of the car, but not bad either. Pat had his choice of any road he decided on. His direction when he pulled out of the campus parking was west. West for no other reason than to follow the sun, and that was by a coin toss. 4 weeks west, 1 week north, 4 weeks east, and 1 more week south would put him back on campus 2 weeks before school started again. Pat yelled goodbye to no one in particular as he drove off. Life was good. Pat didn't actually hit Judge Helen Cartman. Fortunately, Pat had swerved just before that. Also just as fortunate was that pull-on disposable diaper Helen wore. It had been a difficult decision to wear diapers, but necessary for her failing bladder. In this case it was, in those few short seconds, a godsend. Sheriff Potts, to his credit, acted instantly when he heard the screeching tires, and faster still when he saw that the pedestrian involved was none other than Judge Cartman. The ticket read, speeding, reckless driving, and failing to yield to a pedestrian. Pat admitted to 27 miles an hour in a 25 as he'd passed the sheriff, and while that wasn't enough, most times, to get anyone a ticket, it was in this case. Unfortunately, it was because Judge Helen Cartman had taken a look at the radar showing how fast Pat was going. That reckless driving part came when Pat admitted that he turned his gaze away from the road for just a few seconds, failing to see Judge Cartman stepping off the curb. Pat, as it happens, had turned his head to watch a young lady named Lily May walk into the only dinner in town. He didn't tell the sheriff that part about Lily for obvious reasons, just that he'd been looking at the diner as he passed it. A place to eat was what he was thinking about when he turned his head. Of course, had Sheriff Potts also seen Lily, he'd have most likely not seen that near miss either, or even Pat for that matter. That failing to yield part happened just as Pat turned back to watch the road, which was a few short seconds before the judge stepped off the curb. Unfortunately, it was too short a time for Pat to react, and that near miss occurred just as Judge Cartman stepped into that crosswalk. As it happens, the judge herself was also heading for the lunch. Nearly everyone did at that hour. What angered the judge even more, if you don't count the soiled diaper and her heart rate in those seconds, were the witnesses on her behalf. Those 2 witnesses behind Helen who would have sworn that the car actually had clipped her, then disappointed it hadn't. Their smile, slightly wicked, Judge Cartman guessed, was the pleasure they'd gotten from witnessing that incident and the fact that the judge had almost gotten creamed. It was the Badger twins who kept smirking as they told the sheriff what had happened. Surly boys who had never grown up would never grow up. A pain in the judge's neck and almost always in trouble of one sort or another. Boys that Judge Cartman often had dealings with, so those 2, as witnesses, would only be adding insult to her already injured ego. In fact, there would be some laughter later, at Brown's Tractor Pull Bar and Grill, as those 2 boys would describe again Judge Cartman's near miss. So what really infuriated Judge Cartman most were those first few snickers from behind as the judge jumped back and almost into their arms. She was still mad when she sat at her bench. The indignation of changing a diaper she actually soiled only amplified her anger. Most of that anger now aimed at the young man standing before her. Everything that had happened was, in her eyes, his fault. Moreover, almost getting hit by a pastel pink compact, driven by what she and the sheriff had already decided was a young hippie from the north, had only added fuel to that fire. Judge Cartman, like most in that town, didn't cotton to those damn hippies. Judge Cartman was not looking down kindly on the boy standing before her. Pat was shocked when the judge said she was assigning him a public defender. Why he needed one wasn't clear, but he kept that to himself. It wasn't clear to anyone else in that court either, although the sheriff was assuming that the judge was treating this like a capital case. She was mad as hell, and the law was hers to use as she pleased. Unfortunately for Pat, that public defender was Brad Blander. Actually, Brad was the only public defender. Brad was also the owner of Brad's Feed and Seed. Brad had never seen a trial come together that fast, he told Pat. There was surprise in his face as he opened his briefcase and took up pad and pencil. He was still puffing red-faced as Judge Cartman slammed her gavel down for order. Brad was looking over the charges as the bailiff ordered everyone to be seated. Brad couldn't believe he was there for a simple traffic violation, but he too knew the judge. "Brad, you have 5 minutes to confer with your client and render a plea," Judge Cartman said, looking up at the large ornate clock to her left. It didn't take but a couple of minutes for Brad to get the lay of his first case in 17 weeks. Nor much more than another minute for him to suggest a plea to Pat. Fact was, given the witnesses, Pat was guilty as charged, Brad said, and Pat nodded. They came to an agreement right then. Brad also had 2/3 of his store's inventory left to do. "Your Honor," Brad Blander said officially after getting Pat's nod on a plea. Go ahead, Brad," Judge Cartman said impatiently, although she noted he still had 2 minutes left. "Your Honor, my client pleads guilty, and no contest. He pleads guilty to all 3 counts and respectfully would also like to extend his apologies to Your Honor," Brad said. Brad knew Judge Cartman, having grown up in that town. She was Little Miss Priss back when they were kids. With that as a factor and given the circumstances, Pat's chances were slim to none of even walking out of there if he pleaded not guilty and requested a trial. She'd slap him into jail without bond just for the pleasure of doing so, Brad had said. Pat was from out of town and had nearly hit the only judge the town had. It wasn't good. Chapter 2. Pat had thought about what Brad said, but only for a minute or two. He also thought about the fine, but not nearly as much as that jail. If he pleaded guilty, at least he'd be fined, but free. That fine, Brad noted, while it most likely would be high, would at least get him out of there and as far away as the remaining daylight would allow. At least that was the plan when Brad advised Pat to plead guilty. Brad didn't know about the soiled diaper. For that matter, no one else did either. Yes, Brad, and the court appreciates your client's apologies. Is that, in fact, your plea, young man? Judge Cartman asked of Pat through gritted teeth. Yes, ma'am. I mean, yes, Your Honor, Pat said, not sure which way to address the judge. Very well then. You've been duly charged and you've entered a plea of guilty, and no contest to all 3 counts on the citation. In light of that, I will have you back here Monday morning at 10 o'clock for sentencing. Given the risk of flight, I'm going to remand you to our town's jail and held without bail till then, Judge Cartman said with another slam of her gavel. Your Honor. I object. My client has pleaded guilty and apologized, and I see no reason that he must be held over for sentencing, Brad said quickly. Object away, counselor. Your client had pleaded guilty and I have accepted that plea, and I've decided to review the charges over this weekend before sentencing. That is the court's right. Objection noted and denied. Is there anything else? Judge Cartman asked. Again, I demand that my client be sentenced, Bard noted. I've already ruled on that, Judge Cartman noted. Your Honor. Brad said, causing the judge to hold her hand up. One more word, counselor, on that subject and I'll hold you in contempt, and you too can spend the weekend in jail with your client. Is that understood? Judge Cartman asked. Yes, Your Honor, Brad said, knowing deep down that Judge Cartman would do just exactly what she said. Very well then, I will see you both in this courtroom promptly at 10 o'clock Monday morning, Judge Cartman said, hitting the hardwood block with her gavel. Pat couldn't believe his ears, nor could Brad understand that much anger. Brad suggested Pat try and simply do what he had to do, since any appeal would have to go through the judge anyway, and it didn't look good. Besides, any appeal would still have to wait till Monday. On Monday, Brad hoped she'd be calmer. On the bright side, Brad said, that would also be counted as time served. Sheriff Potts was behind Pat when the judge ordered him taken into custody, and in an instant had Pat in handcuffs for the short walk to jail. Pat was beside himself at the prospects of a weekend in jail. It got worse when his single phone call had gotten only his parents' message service. It wasn't likely they would even get the message before the weekend ended, and even if they did, there was little they would be able to do. Judge Cartman wiggled slightly in her fresh disposable, scowling over the experience with that last one and those humiliating giggles from the Badger twins. She admitted to her sister a short time later that in this case it wasn't justice she wanted served so much, but a slight taste of revenge. She would have her minor bit of revenge from Pat, and sooner or later, those Badger twins would be standing before her again. Helen was a patient woman in that regard, and those Badger boys would not snicker much after she was done with them. The boys took that look as a warning sign when the judge turned in their direction. They left court in a hurry. It was the first time Judge Cartman smiled since the episode. Her second smile was after the phone call in her chambers. That was 5 minutes later, after talking to the only other person besides her sister that knew of her incontinence. Susan Ames, the owner of Ames Pharmacy, took the judge's order, promising, as usual, her silence. Susan only thought it odd because the judge had already gotten her month's supply of disposables. Meanwhile, Frank Harms, of Frank's Automotive, told his son Moss to go fetch that hippie's car. Frank's boy Moss, named in honor of that small patch of green where he was conceived on that spring day 14 years ago, left to do what he was told. Frank's Automotive was also the town's impound lot of a sort. It was Moss who took Pat's duffel when the car was finally parked out back. Moss too had been in front of Judge Cartman's bench more than a few times, and taking things was almost a habit for the boy. Pat's only clothing, when that bag came up missing, would be what he was actually wearing. Pat was sitting in a cell 7 feet wide and 10 feet long, reading the names etched into the plaster that covered the concrete blocks. Names, dates, and some very unkind words for both the sheriff and judge as it happens. Pat was also wondering if the names Tim and Tom Badger were the same two that were in court as witnesses. "You got a change of clothes, hippie?" Sheriff Potts asked of Pat after booking him into the tiny jail. There were only 2 cells, and some old man occupied the other one, which had its door still open. "Yes, sir." "They are in a bag in my car," Pat said with a shaky voice. The county didn't pay for jail uniforms, nor cleaning, and Sheriff Potts only nodded when Pat said that before closing the cell door behind him. Sheriff Potts would stop at Frank's on the way to the diner for lunch. Lunch and a long glance at Lily May over a chicken fried steak. At least that was the sheriff's intent when Frank tossed the sheriff Pat's car keys. Frank was under an old Ford pickup truck, and the keys had been in his pocket when the sheriff pulled up. Sheriff Potts walked through the building to the lot and Pat's car. There was nothing in the front or back seats. "No bag," Sheriff Potts told Frank when the sheriff looked in the car. Sheriff Potts was standing at the open back door. "Might be in the trunk, Sheriff," Frank said, hoping his son hadn't gone off and done something stupid again, like take that boy's bag. Chapter 3: What sort of boy drives a car painted that color? Frank said, walking to the door as he wiped his hands. He was looking at the pink compact with those large lavender daisies painted on the door. "Hippies," Sheriff Potts said in that same voice of disgust that Frank used. Frank wasn't thinking hippie when he'd asked. Nor was the sheriff, for that matter. Mostly because the car was pink with flowers on it. Pink with flowers wasn't exactly a manly sort of car, they both decided in their own way. That thought was on the sheriff's mind when he found the large bag in the trunk. The sheriff changed some of what he was thinking in those seconds. It was the only bag now in the car thanks to Moss. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Potts said as he unzipped the bag he'd pulled out and carried to his own car. His intent was to search it for weapons or drugs. Actually, he'd said damn more than once as he went through the contents. That first "well, I'll be damned" came when he opened the trunk and saw a hot pink bag with Barbie's name decorating it. Of course that wasn't Pat's bag. Moss, as it happens, was actually going through Pat's bag in the old barn 100 feet from there. Wasn't much as far as Moss was concerned, but, he mused, as he tried on Pat's jeans, the price was right. In the meantime, Sheriff Potts was doing his own bit of musing in those same seconds. That pink bag was filled with girls' clothing. Very clearly girls' clothes and obviously not Pat's, if the sheriff had asked, but the sheriff had already formed another opinion of Pat. The pink car decorated with flowers made more sense now. So too the long hair and sandals the boy wore. As it happens, those clothes belonged to Tracy Marks. Tracy Marks was a friend of Pat's sister. Tracy had tossed that bag into Pat's sister's trunk a few days earlier. Ironically, Tracy was still fuming over that since her best friend Cindy was now in Europe, and that geek of a brother had taken the car for the summer. Some of her favorite summer dresses were in that bag. That second "I'll be damned" came when the sheriff lifted out the matching makeup bag to go through that before he carried it back with him to the jail. Sheriff Potts had never had one of those types in his jail before this, and he wasn't all that keen over having one now. Although, to the sheriff's credit, he knew girls felt better with a little makeup on, and he suspected that a boy who wants to be a girl must feel the same way. Also, to the sheriff's credit, he'd keep his opinions to himself. Most of all, he'd keep his prejudices in check. At least now the sheriff understood why that boy had long hair, wore sandals, and drove a pink car. He sat the bags on his desk and picked up the phone. Having one of that sort of person in his jail changed things. It changed things a lot. "Hello," Judge Cartman said after picking up her phone. "Judge, listen, that boy isn't a hippie like we thought. He's one of those transfigured people. I just found a bag of girls' clothes and makeup in his car," Sheriff Potts said. "Girls' clothes? The boys? What do you mean transfigured?" Judge Cartman asked, a little confused till she suddenly realized that the sheriff most likely meant transsexual, as she added, "Do you mean transsexual?" "Transsexual. Yes, that's the word. Yes. Yes, that's it. He's obviously one of those guys that dresses and acts like a girl," the sheriff said and added, "Not a stitch of boy's clothes other than what he was wearing, but I transsexual." "Okay. Damn. Wait a second, you don't have him in a cell with any other guys, do you?" "I mean, you can't have him in a cell with guys," Judge Cartman asked in a sudden panic. "Nope. Only other person in the jail right now is Old Man Turner. Picked him up again this morning," Sheriff Potts said and added, "The boy is by himself right now." "Girl," Judge Cartman said, correcting the sheriff. "Girl what?" Sheriff Potts asked, confused. "If he's a transsexual, then he prefers being called a girl. So start calling her by the proper gender pronouns." Not clear on the law for these guys, but it also means there's most likely some sort of civil rights laws being violated if we don't treat him like one, Judge Cartman noted in frustration. "Like one what?" Sheriff Potts asked. "Like a girl, for heaven's sakes. You slow or what? What have we been talking about so far?" Judge Cartman said, losing patience over Sheriff Potts being so slow on the uptake. "Right. Okay, I got it. So he's a girl and I got to treat him like a girl," Sheriff Potts said. Okay is right, and you be damn careful on how you treat her, and I mean that. I don't want you to even consider doing anything that might infringe on her civil rights. In fact, treat her like she's the daughter of the President of the United States for the moment. I've got only a few rulings I've seen on those people, and I don't want this one suing us. Don't want her ending up owning the damn town simple because we violated her rights. Meanwhile, I'll do some research, Judge Cartman said. Another new wrinkle, Judge Cartman mused as she looked over at her casebooks. Got it, Sheriff Potts said before his goodbye. Sheriff Potts picked up the clothes bag, checked one more time for contraband, smiled as he shook his head, then made his way to the cells. The boy took on a new look to the sheriff as he stood by the bars of Pat's cell. Can't let you have any makeup just yet till I've looked through it better, but you can choose one change of clothes, the sheriff said, setting the larger bag in front of Pat's cell so Pat had access to it. Pat looked at the Barbie bag and then at the sheriff. There was confusion on his face. That's not my bag, and those aren't my things, Pat said, looking at the hot pink bag and those Barbie decorations again as the sheriff unzipped it. Sheriff Potts had a sudden touch of sympathy for the boy. Must be tough, he thought, going through life like that. The sheriff automatically assumed why the boy wouldn't admit those were his things. Some of that sympathy came from the sheriff's own little collection of feminine things he kept in several evidence bags in county storage. Although, the sheriff decided, and justifiably so, that at least in his case, he didn't wear his stuff. Sheriff Potts did, however, get that look he often got when a prisoner took on any kind of resistance. Sheriff Potts didn't like a prisoner being defiant. Sheriff Potts took on his authoritative stance and cleared his throat. Chapter 4. Boy, you listen up. I mean girl, you listen up and listen good, because I'm only going to say this once. You get 3 squares a day, 1 hour out back exercising, a change of clothes and a shower. That's the law, and it's my ass if you don't get those things. If you know what's good for you, you'll take what you need out of there and keep your mouth shut. I don't want any sass from you, you hear? Sheriff Potts said in what he called his law enforcement voice. The deep angry tone and imposing figure scared Pat nearly witless in less than a second. He was in a small town and in jail, and that sheriff could lift him with a single arm. Pat could only nod, and it was a yes. He wasn't sure what the sheriff was doing with those things nor why he wanted Pat to wear them, but he was too scared to do anything but nod again. Good. Now then, I'm the law around here and rules is rules, so you take about another minute or 2 and pick something out to wear for after your shower. If not, I'm going to do the picking and you might not like what I chose. You hear me, Sheriff Potts said as he raised himself full height. Pat made an immediate assumption and shivered over it. Pat was in a town no larger than half his campus. 4 or 5 blinks of an eye even at 25 miles an hour. He was in a part of America, he assumed, that didn't vote liberal much. Pat shivered a little as he bent down with the assumption that the bag actually belonged to the sheriff or perhaps even to the town. There were 5 small dresses all purchased for summer, which was why Tracy had been so mad at Pat's sister. There were also several slips, a couple of bras, and a half-dozen panties, not to mention that new bag. Pat prayed silently that all the sheriff wanted was to just see him in a dress as he pulled out the first dress from the bag. It was the flowery pink one sitting at the top. Grab your undies as well. The shower is out back. The sheriff said, noting that the boy didn't hesitate to take up that dress, and predictably or rather she took up the pink one. Girls like pink, and apparently so do boys that want to be girls, the sheriff mused. Pat noticed the sheriff's leer as he took up a slip, pair of panties and bra. Of course, if either could read minds, the whole scene would have unfolded quite differently. That leer, as it happens, was actually over the slip, bra and panties Pat held and not over Pat wearing them as he suspected. Pat did get a fragrant bar of soap from the smaller pink bag with the makeup in it, and the sheriff, thinking he'd ease the boy's fears a little, also included a tube of lipstick. Sheriff had remembered a date of his telling him that a touch of lipstick was like a little bit of therapy. It was an act of kindness for the sheriff, but another terrifying moment for Pat as he moved down the hall towards the bathroom with his new stuff. That pervert wanted him to wear lipstick besides, Pat thought. Tracy was an inch taller than Pat and about the same weight, although Pat had no way of knowing any of that. Since Pat didn't know who owned those things or even if they fit, Pat could only assume that the sheriff did. Pat wasn't surprised that the slip came over the bra and panties in a surprisingly good fit in that small bathroom. The movie Deliverance and one particular scene he remembered almost made him cry as Pat stepped into those pink lacy panties following his shower. It was the first time Pat had ever used lipstick as well. Pat also used the girlish scrunchie the sheriff had grabbed for Pat's hair from that same makeup bag. It matched the dress, or at least the sheriff thought it did, and who was he to judge, he decided, as he handed that to Pat as well just before closing the bathroom door. Sheriff Potts, as he walked back to his desk, was wondering what the boy looked like as a girl. That old man, in the cell next to Pat's, got slightly more confused when Sheriff Potts walked that girl back to where that boy had been. Must not have been a boy, the old man decided, as he wished in that same thought for a small shot of whiskey. Didn't often get girls in jail, although the old man also assumed he might be hallucinating as he so often did. Clem! You mind your own business and your manners, you hear, Sheriff Potts said after noting the leer on the old man's face before adding, come on you old fart, you're next for a shower and you need it, so get your butt out of there. Pat sat again on the cell bed watching quietly, intently and scared of what might happen. Same cell as before, only this time he was wearing a light pink flowery summer dress over a slip, bra and panties. The bra had small soft foam uplifts sewn into it, giving Pat a slight B cup if that mattered. Pat was trying to ignore what he was wearing and what it meant but couldn't. All the while wondering what his fate was and nearly on the verge of tears over those images of what he imagined it could be. The sheriff had taken his boy clothes now stuffed in a net bag, leaving him only his sandals when he came out of the shower. 20 minutes later the sheriff walked that old man back to his cell and looked at Pat once again. Made a fairly decent-looking girl was the sheriff's thoughts. Although Pat took that look slightly further and this time he did begin to cry softly. He was sitting there with his knees together in his own sandals with his feet turned inward, making him look very feminine and very vulnerable. Very feminine, the sheriff thought, which went in Pat's favor in those seconds. It wasn't a bad look, the sheriff thought. That view actually made the sheriff a tad bit more sympathetic. Sheriff Potts was, more often than not, a kinder soul than he appeared to be. His thoughts changed a little when he settled in on the notion that the boy liked being a girl. The sheriff got even more sympathetic with that pitiful face now streaking with tears. The whole look tugged at him in those seconds. Girls crying always did that to him, and in those seconds he decided that the boy was more girl than boy. He softened instantly, and some of it because the boy was acting like a girl sitting there so demurely. She, as Potts now thought of her, was scared, that was obvious, and this was most likely her first time in jail. Just wasn't fair treating her like this, not for some silly traffic violations. Then the sheriff had another thought, making him shiver a little, as he murmured to himself, damn. It had struck him full in the face. It was Friday. Friday, and the bars would be filling in a couple of hours. Friday, and in a few more hours Sheriff Potts would be filling these two small cells. Last thing the sheriff wanted was to shove a bunch of drunk rednecks and horny farmers in with that boy dressed the way he or she was. Sheriff smiled over his confusion on what to call the boy or girl, but frowned over what he imagined might or most definitely would happen. Sheriff Potts stepped to his desk and picked up his phone again. The sheriff punched the numbers in quickly. "Hello," Judge Cartman's sister Rose said, answering the phone. "Hi, Rose. "It's me," Sheriff Potts said when Helen answered and asked, "Listen, is the judge around?" "It's kind of an emergency." Chapter 5. Hold on, Rose said. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Helen asked after her sister said it was an emergency. "It's about that young man. I mean that girl we got in jail here." "Helen, listen, that girl is about as scared as any child can be, and frankly I can't blame her. It's just a damn traffic ticket." "But that's not the point, Helen. The point is it's Friday," Sheriff Potts said. The judge had no clue over what the sheriff was talking about till she got a Reader's Digest version of what the sheriff meant by it being Friday. As mad as Helen was over that boy's carelessness, her fright and soiling her disposable, she too didn't want that girl being harmed. She also, in those same moments and based on what the sheriff said earlier over those tears, assumed Pat was definitely closer to a Patricia than a Patrick. Law is clear on men and women not sharing cells. Helen wasn't completely clear on the law about men that wanted to be women, so it was simply going to be easier to assume Pat was female and just let it go at that. "Damn it! You're right, Sheriff. We can't have her sitting in a cell with that Friday and Saturday crowd. Tell you what, bring her back to my chambers and I'll change my orders to house arrest. I'll put her up at Claire's for the weekend," Judge Cartman said after thinking about where the girl could stay. They had housed a runaway girl there once. Sheriff Potts went back into the cell area and said, "I'm about to start filling these cells with some of our locals, so it's going to be better that you aren't in here when that happens. That is if you promise to keep your mouth shut about all this." "I mean that, about talking. Anyway, the judge has agreed to put you up in a safer place," Sheriff Potts said and added, hoping to cheer the girl up, a bit more comfortable as well. In truth, Sheriff Potts was telling Pat to keep his mouth shut about breaking the rules of confinement. Remanding a person to jail then letting them out without changing those orders was the issue. Of course Pat assumed it was over the way he was dressed and not getting the sheriff and whoever else was involved in this in trouble as he nodded his agreement. There was a sense of relief over the prospects of at least getting out of there, but fear still over what was happening. Pat, in the hope of not angering the sheriff, eagerly promised not to say a word about any of this. "I'm going to say this again. Not a word about this to anyone. And, if you try taking off between now and Monday, just add another 12 months to your weekend for breaking jail. Understood?" Sheriff Potts said. Pat nodded quickly. Whatever the sheriff was up to, Pat decided he had no choice in it. What he did know was that he was getting out of that jail and away from that old man's leer. A second later he was standing outside of his cell. Pat was walking alongside the sheriff after leaving the jail. He nodded his agreement again just before stepping outside and right after the sheriff warned him again. It was still daylight, almost dusk. They walked out of the cell together and onto the street. Given Pat's size, the way he was dressed, his hair, and that bit of lipstick made him look every bit the girl he was dressed as. Those two bags, the one with makeup and the other with the clothes Pat now carried, only added to his look as he walked alongside the sheriff. At least that was Claire's assumption when Pat stood at the door with the sheriff when she opened it. Judge Cartman had called Claire after getting the boy's promise to behave and cooperate till Monday. It was also the judge's opinion that the boy was clearly one of those types of boys, and obviously Claire shared that opinion just as quickly and just as easily. Judge Cartman made a note on Pat's booking form and she altered orders on confining her. Judge Cartman was playing it safe legally. She also made a note that Pat was to be treated legally as Patricia. She knew the law but not all of it, and that part she didn't know could, she believed, hurt her. Judge Cartman didn't want a messy civil rights issue hounding her near election time. Only Judge Cartman was still upset. She had been scared enough to soil her diaper and that had angered her a lot. Putting that girl up at Claire's wasn't punishment at all. Of course, the judge didn't know Pat didn't want to dress as a girl. Since the judge didn't know Pat was already going through about 4 kinds of hell, she didn't see much justice yet. Helen called and caught the sheriff at Claire's, telling Potts to bring the girl to her chambers again. Judge Cartman also had that idea she formed earlier in a way to get a little justice. Helen wanted some of that justice for her own ego's sake. Since she couldn't keep that girl in jail for the weekend and that jail time was to have been her punishment, she could perhaps teach her a lesson another way. She was going to impose that part of it on Monday anyway, so it was simply going to be sooner than later. Pat walked back into the courthouse, now closed for the day's business but open for this occasion. The sheriff knocked on Judge Cartman's chamber door and opened it when the judge said, "Come in." "You want to wait outside, Sheriff?" Judge Cartman said. "Yes, ma'am," Sheriff Potts noted as he turned for the door. Fearing his prisoner a flight risk wasn't a thought as the sheriff stepped outside, closing the door after him. "Now then, young lady, it's obvious we can't keep you confined given our limited facilities and the crowd about to form there. That means you're under house arrest for now." "Understood?" Judge Cartman asked. Pat didn't like the reference to him being a girl, but he wasn't about to complain since he was out of that jail cell at least. Pat wasn't sure what was going on or why they wanted him in a dress, but not being in that cell was enough reason to be calmer. He also wasn't clear why he was back in the judge's chambers. Chapter 6. "Yes, ma'am," Pat said. "And, if you don't mind, and so this change in confinement doesn't look so odd, we'll be referring to you as Patricia for the time being. That will also justify this change in location. I'm noting that change in your booking form, so you'll have to initial it," Judge Cartman said and added, "Is that also clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Pat answered. Patricia was a girl's name and obviously the judge was in on this, whatever this was. He was beginning to suspect it was his punishment, but why he was being punished like this wasn't clear at all. The judge twisted a form so it faced Pat, pointing at the name Pat that had been changed to Patricia. Pat took up the pen and initialed the change as instructed. The judge picked the form up, looked over the changes and slipped it once again into a manila folder. "And not a word of this to anyone, right?" Judge Cartman said. Pat, of course, did mind having his name changed, but he was making assumptions based on his own opinion of this judge, the sheriff and even this town. Why they were doing this wasn't clear, but they were doing it and they wanted him silent. Besides, right then he was simply too afraid to ask or complain. Pat nodded his agreement again. Had to be something connected with that near miss, and most likely this was intended to be humiliating since the judge had been humiliated. He'd humiliated the judge and now she was getting even. What made it somewhat more palatable was the relief that it wasn't some perverted plan of the sheriff's. Pat had assumed all manner of things, most of which had scared him senseless. At least he wasn't going to be spending the night with some dirty old man or a bunch of dirty young men. It made Pat feel a little better. Not much given what he was wearing, but a little. Since I've had to endure jail punishment, there is still justice to be served, and I've got to tell you right now, young lady, that I was pretty damn mad at you for scaring me like that, Judge Cartman said. "Yes, ma'am. I really am sorry. I didn't mean that to happen," Pat said. "Nonetheless, you did, and I'm going to share with you a bit of why that is. You say a word about this to anyone. I mean anyone, and you'll be a year older when you see freedom again," Judge Cartman said and added, "Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Pat said. "Okay, then, just so we understand each other. Anyway, I'm angry because you embarrassed the hell out of me. Some of that embarrassment is because I'm incontinent. Damn it, I'm incontinent, and again, if you breath a word of that to another living soul, you'll rue the day. Is that understood?" Judge Cartman asked. "Yes, ma'am." Pat said as he digested that new and very odd bit of information. It explained now why the judge was so mad and, in a way, it added another reason for the girl clothes. He'd embarrassed the judge and now it was her turn to embarrass him. Made sense in a twisted sort of way. Good, because your new sentence, beginning in just a minute, is that you share in my discomfort for the remainder of this weekend. Perhaps if you had to wear what I wear you'd get an appreciation for senior citizens and why you need to be mindful of them when you're in a car, Judge Cartman said. Pat wasn't sure what the judge was actually saying until the judge picked up a plastic grocery bag and sat it on her desk as she said, "You got 7 diapers in here." 7 disposable diapers. They're the same ones I wear. You'll be wearing them for the next 2 days. 1 to wear out of here and 3 more for each day till Monday morning. Is that understood? This had been weird up to now. Now it was getting even more bizarre. Although it was definitely clearer now on why Pat was dressed as a girl. Pat could only wonder how bad it had been for her when he nearly hit the woman sitting behind her desk. So that was it. Pat's relief was mixed with how he was being punished, but at least it now made sense. Pa was definitely being humiliated. Obviously she'd most likely wet herself or worse. The judge, Pat mused, must have been very uncomfortable following that near miss. It was an odd way of punishing a guy, but given his options at the moment all he could do was nod. "Bathroom's over there," Judge Cartman said, handing Chuck a foamy soft white mound of a diaper from the bag on her desk. She also added a pair of clear plastic pants. Pat took both and walked towards the bathroom, hoping he could get through this as quickly as possible. Of course, if his folks called back, this was the last thing he'd want them to know. He would tell them that it was a mistake and that he actually wasn't in jail. That he'd been released and that was that. It was all a misunderstanding, he'd say on his next message. Pat had the slip and dress up around his chest as he brought the diaper between his legs. He tapped it closed with some amount of difficulty, given it would have been better laying down, but he didn't want to do that. Pat added the plastic pants, which made the diaper more snug. His panties, the ones belonging to Tracy, were stretched a little more now, making the diaper even more snug. Pat left the bathroom and met the judge again, who was standing in front of her desk with that bag of 6 remaining diapers. "Okay, turn around for a moment. This is simply to confirm that you're wearing it," Judge Cartman said. Pat felt the judge's hand pat him once. There was no doubt Pat was wearing a diaper, Judge Cartman mused happily. "Good. As I said, a couple of days wearing what I have to wear might make you a little more careful next time," the judge said, feeling better now. Pat assumed she was also talking about the dress, slip, bra and panties as well. In an odd sort of way, it was all Pat needed for his new understanding of this. Actually, the only reason Pat was even relieved at all was knowing now that it wasn't the sheriff's idea. As bad as this was, those images he'd conjured up about the sheriff had been far worse. "You've met Claire, she's a friend of mine and very understanding. She owns the local beauty parlor and I've explained why you'll be staying there. You are to do what she says, and I'm warning you that means everything. Understood?" Judge Cartman noted. "Yes, ma'am," Pat said. Chapter 7. Claire was also born in Millburg, but she'd been gone for 5 years before taking the shop over from her mother. After beauty school and her business degree, she turned her mother's old beauty shop into a delightfully pretty and successful saloon. It was, as she so often put it, a decent sort of way to make a living. Ironically, Claire was looking at Pat in a motherly sort of way. As a mother might a daughter, and thinking how much better he'd look with a little foundation, touch of color, and something done with those pretty eyes of hers, and she too thought of Pat as Patricia. Judge Cartman, for her part in this, couldn't think of a better place to house Pat, and for any number of reasons. Not the least of which Helen assuming that the boy would be far more comfortable and so much safer in that environment. A boy that wants to be a girl is going to be comfortable with a woman that loves making girls pretty. Judge Cartman also knew Claire and her kindness, so she also knew that the boy wouldn't have much of a civil case if that particular push ever came to a shove. Judge Cartman could now prove, with loads of witnesses, that she had taken every measure to make sure that the little transsexual was treated with kindness and respect. Claire, to her credit, had a far more liberal outlook on life, having lived some of it in the big city. As it happens, Claire had known 2 transsexuals in beauty school and another that, by his own admission, was flaming in his outlook on what he was. So, Claire simply assumed she was looking at one of those as she opened her back door to Pat once again, Judge Cartman and the sheriff. Pat, on the other hand, made further assumptions on this odd punishment of his. Ironically, it made perfectly good sense in a warped sort of way. I mean, what better place is there to humiliate a guy that you've dressed like a girl and diapered than to put him smack dab in the middle of a beauty salon? Pat gritted his teeth as he took Claire's hand in greeting. Pat also vowed, right then and there, to keep a strong grip on his pride and hold his ego intact no matter what. They might think they were humiliating him, and of course they were, but he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him buckle under, and to hell with their twisted sense of justice. Pat could be pretty defiant when he wanted to be. In fact, Pat decided he was going to make damn sure they saw just the opposite. He actually forced a smile back to Claire's when she took his hand. He'd show this lady Claire, that judge and the sheriff a thing or two about guts. Besides, he'd be clear of this place soon enough, and who cared what they thought after that? He wasn't going to let them see him frightened anymore. Claire, of course, took Pat's smile as confirmation of a sort, and so did Judge Helen. Claire also took to Patrick as easily as she might a girl, but that was Claire in a nutshell. What bothered her in those minutes was obviously his lipstick and that hair. She didn't like the color, it wasn't on very well, and Pat's hair needed a serious amount of work. Pat's lipstick was red and he was wearing pink. Bad combination, Claire mused, and his hair needed a good shampoo, brushing, and at least a conditioner. He could definitely use a little blush as well, and those nails, bitten to the nubs, were a disgrace. Claire would fix those first, she decided. Nothing like a little bit of femininity to make you feel girlish, Claire mused. Judge Cartman left Pat there with another promise that he'd better cooperate and cooperate fully. If not, the judge warned, he'd be right back in that jail. The sheriff had let the judge talk and walked off when she had finished. Meanwhile, Claire decided that this boy who wanted to be a girl would get her best efforts, and mostly for his sake. Claire was the personification of a nurturing female with a heart as big, some said, as her bosom. Claire pitied the young man, his fate, given that the judge had also told her about the diapers. That part, as uncomfortable as it must be for the young lady, Claire mused, she was certain she could at least make her comfortable by making her pretty. Comfortable to Claire was a day at her salon. To Claire, nothing was more beneficial for a woman than a day at the salon. Given the circumstances of Pat's odd incarceration, it was clear he would benefit as well. Pat, or rather Patricia, as far as Claire was concerned, was going to get full benefit of her salon. Pat was in Claire's house when Judge Cartman walked away. Sheriff Potts had returned to the office, relieved somewhat to be free of this odd young man. Claire left Pat in her spare bedroom to put away his things when she went into the salon to address the girls working there. So, just remember, and most important of all, is that a transsexual believes he's female, and according to most experts, she is, in spite of what her body suggests. That is very important to these guys as girls, so I want you to consider her as much a female as we are. Understood? And no questions about why she's the way she is. She is, and that's that. Is that also clear? Claire said to her staff of 5. They all nodded. For them it was kind of exciting. It was a change of pace in an often dull environment after the Friday rush to get ready for dates. At least it was something different, and the girls were all smiles as Claire left to return with Pat. Claire, again, believed she was doing the right thing, and now to those girls as they waited. To the girls' credit, Pat was going to get their best efforts, and Sally began with a waxing that was flawless when Pat was handed over to her. Cute puffy bottom, Sally mused, as she picked up the pot with the warm wax. It was both painful and soothing as she stripped him of his light blonde body hair. The small single-person sauna opened his pores before a fragrant shower left him feeling soft and, like it or not, slightly feminine. Pat had done both without his diaper. He knew he'd need a fresh one, and so did Claire, and things changed again when Pat saw the diaper laying on the bench arranged next to the shower and sauna. Next to it also were a different pair of panties. Pat took the panties up, wondering if those had been in the bag with the other, then realizing they were much bigger. Pat didn't know this, but Claire, knowing Pat would be wearing diapers under the judge's orders, needed a larger size panty. She's seen the regular panties Pat wore, deciding they were too snug to fit over a diaper and plastic pants. Claire also knew, or thought she did, that a transsexual liked wearing panties with lace. They were Claire's panties Pat was holding. A size 5 and far too big for Pat without the diaper and those baby pants, but almost a perfect fit over the extra padding. Not only were they larger, but Claire, assuming Pat loved ruffles and lace as much as she did, gave up her best pair for this occasion. Claire, when she wasn't running her salon, was one of the county's best square dancers, and she loved the ruffles and lace she wore under her outfits. What girl wouldn't, she mused, picking the pink pair for her guest. Claire liked wearing those ruffled panties when she went dancing. She'd chosen her pink pair that went with her pink petticoats, and it was too bad Patricia wasn't wearing those. Not only pink, ruffled and laced, but Claire had taken the time long ago to add a cute tiny bow just above that last row of lace. She loved teasing the boys even at her age. Over baby pants and a diaper, they reminded Claire of a baby girl's rumba panties. It gave her a delightful image of Pat in those thoughts. Chapter 8. Pat was soon stepping into those ruffled lace panties after laying on the sauna's bench to diaper himself. Claire had added that small sauna and shower you could mix fragrant mist into, right after she reopened. The women loved it, and Pat had chosen lavender when Claire pointed out the various fragrances. That sauna and attached shower had paid for itself within months, and some women often came in for just that and 10 minutes on the tanning bed. Pat smelled of fresh flowers when he stepped out of his shower and into a pink nylon smock. Pat's dress was on a hanger, and he only wore his bra, slip and Claire's panties over that plastic pair of pants and diaper under his smock. He was led back to the salon part and sat in the last chair, with none of the other customers the wiser, other than the girl being new in these parts, some thought, as Mandy covered him in a pink bib. A star of some fame wouldn't have gotten any better treatment as the girls descended on Pat. Pat gritted his teeth, reciting his vow to not let it get to him. He said that to himself over and over again as his fingertips were dipped into a lavender and pink bowl of liquid. No matter what happened, Pat noted he would not show how he felt as he relaxed his hands slightly. His nails grew longer with a silk wrap, and took on a soft rounded point. They soon glowed with a blush pink polish under a translucent glitter. A popular color with the younger girls, and nearly perfect a color for Pat's dress. His nails were a half-inch longer than they had been when he sat, and felt odd when he moved his fingers or hand. His hair was shampooed, conditioned and blow-dried before being brushed to either side. Those 2 ponytails were set off by ribbon with 2 strips of light pink satin. Claire did those bows perfectly and smiled over how much just that part had changed Pat's look. Pat made a very pretty young girl, she decided. He did, as a matter of fact, although Pat tried not paying attention to his image in the mirror. Claire also did his face, and she'd been top in her class on making a girl over. Pat did look very much like a Patricia when Claire stepped back to admire her handiwork. His foundation, a very light tan that matched his forearm color perfectly, blended his face nearly flawless. She blushed the apple of his cheeks with a very soft pink, and cast a light shadow below that with a darker blush instantly thinning his face. Pat's lipstick, a light rose, went on after a darker rose was used as an outline. The treatment made Pat's lips look thicker, giving him a feminine, pouting look. It was very flattering against his light lavender eyeshadow and black liner. His eyelashes were much longer, thicker and perfect as he fluttered against the odd feel the mascara caused. He could, or so Claire believed, walk out of there, handbag in hand, as easily as any of them. Meanwhile, Judge Cartman was back home with her sister. The boy had enough problems, Helen decided, and he would be released come Monday, she decided. Helen was satisfied on her punishment and glad now that he, or rather she, was at Claire's. The boy or girl already had his or her issues walking through this world as a girl. She didn't want to compound his life any more than she needed to, but, then again, he'd nearly killed her, or at least could have, and that had needed to be addressed and had. The fact that she changed his baby pants to pink, to her, was simply another act of kindness in a whole list of them coming together that day as Pat was. Pat meanwhile was standing in front of a long mirror in a mild state of shock. He looked like his sister and in more ways than one, and avoided completely the fact that he was as pretty as her. His toes in his sandals were the same color as his fingertips. Pat's slip was now sliding, smoothing over his legs, leaving him quietly aware of why they called them slips. Claire and the girls beamed at his silence, assuming happily that they'd done their job. They were as proud as any group of girls preparing a bride for her most important day, and felt like bridesmaids in those minutes. One of them giggled. Pat was, without a doubt, beautiful. Those few giggles, impossible to ignore, didn't seem as bad, as Pat felt his world slide a little and in an odd sort of way. It was also that slip moving across the front and back of his satiny smooth legs. Even the thickness of his diaper added some amount of something, and he didn't want to say pleasure yet. He was being punished. Punished by an entire town, so there was that, but there was something else as well. Pat silently renewed his vow of not letting it get to him, but it had a little. Actually, it had bothered him a lot, but not the way it should have. He wasn't feeling nearly as bad as he'd hoped, so that vow was made with slightly less conviction than before. It was just 5 in the evening when Claire told Tina to close at 6. She and Pat were going to dinner and then home. Tina often closed for Claire and nodded before hugging Pat. An act that left Pat slightly confused but hugging back. Pat was petrified over the walk out of the beauty salon, but Claire assured him that he'd pass without a hitch if he simply took shorter steps, kept his arms at his side more, and imagined a glass of water sitting on top of his head. Something he mumbled over and over again several times as they walked to the single crosswalk that had started all of this. He was holding a pink clutch from Claire's own collection as they crossed the street for the dinner. The Badger twins, coming to a stop for the girls to cross, hooted a couple of times in their old farm truck. They smiled curiously as they waited for Claire and that little fox with her to pass. They'd never seen her in those parts as she crossed the street. The only reason they stopped leering at all was that look from Claire. Both boys knew Claire. Each boy had his own memories of those days in high school when Claire teased them into some of her things. It was done separately back then, and neither boy knew about the other, but that look from Claire suggested they go silent, and instantly they did. Last thing they wanted was for Claire to mention to anyone else that both boys knew how to curtsy like little girls. They didn't recognize the girl at all, nor did they connect her to that young man they'd been willing to testify against. They did hope she, whoever she was, would be here in town for a time. Besides Lily and a few others, the pickings in that town were slim. Chapter 9. Too much but, Tim said to his twin brother Tom as Pat and Claire passed them to the other side of the street. Not all that big and I like the way it moves, Tom said as the diaper slightly exaggerated Pat's walk. Nor breast for that matter either, Tim said. As long as they fill my hand, Tom answered with a laugh. I'd date her, Tim said with a twist of a smile. Me too, Tom said as he eased the old truck into a short lurch on their way to Brown's Tractor Pull Bar and Grill. They would think of Pat as Patricia for most of that evening, and Pat as Patrick would have shuddered once again over those thoughts if he could read them. You have a natural sense of self about you, Claire said, mounting the curb a second before Pat. Thank you, I think, Pat said, just this side of sarcastic, and only because he wasn't sure about Claire. He was sure about the rest of them, or at least the sheriff and judge, but not her, nor the girls, as he added, I'm never going to let them have the satisfaction of seeing me falter. Claire, and rightfully so, assumed Patricia was talking about the world in general. About him being a transsexual. Her knowing the difficulties of those other transsexuals gave her some small amount of understanding. Her transsexual friends were not too unlike this young lady in that sense, and once again she felt that maternal tug within her as she slipped an arm around Pat's shoulder suddenly to hug him again. What was that for? Pat asked, feeling suddenly warm but a little confused over this woman's sudden and clear affections. You and that to hell with them attitude. I think it's marvelous. I admire you for that, Claire said as she began walking again towards the restaurant. Pat followed alongside, wondering over what he just said as Claire added, you also need to know that you've already got a lot of support around here. Again those words were understood differently in Pat's context, and again it strengthened his resolve as he stood a little straighter and walked a bit more regal. He assumed, and this also rightfully so, that she meant some didn't agree with this form of punishment. It made him feel a lot more steadfast, but also a bit more casual as they neared the door. Pat, as Patricia, walked into the restaurant far braver than he would have without Claire's words, and just as they entered he said to her, "Thank you, and I mean that." "Honey, you're welcome." "And I mean that as well," Claire said, touching him lightly on the arm as they entered. Both smiled at each other as the smells of the restaurant and noise made them take notice. "Hey Claire," Lily May said from behind the counter as the two entered. Lily had been the cause of the accident and Pat blushed suddenly. "Hey Lily," Claire said as Lily came up and got hugged. Claire was, as far as Pat could tell, a hugger. Another thing in her favor, he decided, as Claire added, "And this is our guest for the weekend, Patricia." "Patricia Fields." "Patricia, this is Lily." Pat flushed a slightly darker shade than his blush, which only added to his blush as Lily said hi. It was the same girl Patrick had been watching instead of the road. He wasn't very keen on her seeing him as a girl though, and almost said something in his defense before biting his tongue. Instead, and in his lightest, softest voice, he said hi back, and the blush remained as he and Claire found a seat. This was, as far as Pat was concerned, the weirdest day of his life. Insane might be a better way to describe what was happening to him. He was sure Lily knew he was a boy, but she didn't seem to mind. He was wearing a dress. A dress and lingerie of all things. A diaper as well. A dress and makeup, and in the middle of evening in a small town, in a restaurant. Now, what was wrong with that picture? What really bothered him most, in those minutes, was that no one else noticed anything wrong with that picture. Or, put another way, and thinking back on those two lunkheads in the truck, they were noticing him, but not seeing he was a boy in a dress. That was what was wrong with this picture. That picture reminded him of those images you tilt and the image changes. Was that all it took? That slight bit of tilt? Meanwhile, So what you going to do with that boy? Rose asked of her sister Helen as they got ready to head out for dinner. Girl, Helen said, correcting her sister. Girl. Girl? Rose noted with a questioning tone. Already done it, Helen said and added, couple of days in diapers and I'm thinking about a few hours of community service this weekend. Sandy's still out with the flu and I can use some office support. Diapers? You said diapers, Rose asked and added, now how is putting him? I mean putting her in diapers going to serve justice? My kind of justice. Do you have any idea what it's like soiling yourself? And worse, those damn Badger twins were nearby when I did it. About the worst day I've had and that's that, Helen said. Sounds more like revenge, Rose said. Not really. Okay, maybe a little. She's not in jail at least so I had to do something to punish her, Helen said. So she's wearing diapers in jail, Rose said, slightly shocked over her sister's sense of justice. Chapter 10. No, she's wearing those diapers over at Claire's. I took her out of jail before it starts filling up with the Friday crowd, Helen noted. Why you calling him a her and why am I? You keep talking about him as a her, Rose asked. Turns out he's. Now you got me doing it. I mean she's a transsexual, Helen noted. Really? So he's a she, Rose asked. Not sure how far that goes, but yes, he's a she, Helen noted. Never met a transsexual, Rose said curiously. I thought about that and given that some look like females means we may have, Helen noted. Never thought about that either. So what about this one? Rose asked. Well, if you saw this one before knowing she was a he, you'd probably still be saying that. Makes a damn cute girl, Helen said. Always wondered why men might want to do that, Rose noted. I don't know, but if I had to guess I say it was our panties. Always wondered why boys liked cotton rather than nylon, Helen noted with a laugh as she added, I miss wearing panties. True, Rose added as she picked up her purse. The restaurant filled slowly but surely as Pat and Claire looked over the short menu. Sheriff Potts had an account at Millie's and Lily mentioned that to Pat as she handed him a menu. Lily too now knew that the pretty girl she was looking at was once a boy thanks to Frank's comments over lunch. Frank was sworn to secrecy but too late and Lily had confirmed what Frank had said with the sheriff. There was something else working on Pat in these few hours. The fear was drifting away and with it some of his anger over what they'd made him do. He wasn't sure what was replacing it nor why he felt as casual as it did and that occupied a lot of his thoughts as he looked over the menu. How many guys have they done this to? Pat asked of Claire when she looked up. Pat was feeling comfortable with Claire and guessing she wasn't actually part of this other than for the makeup and such. Done what to who, honey? Claire asked. You know, make men wear dresses like this, Pat asked. Make men wear dresses. Who makes men wear dresses? Claire asked. Sheriff Potts and that judge, Pat asked. I'm not sure what you mean, Claire asked, genuinely confused. Okay, so why did the sheriff make me dress like a girl? Pat asked and added, was it the judge's idea, his or both? Make you? Honey, the sheriff didn't make you dress that way? Sheriff Potts can be a lunkhead at times but he'd never do that? Not to a guy that didn't already wear dresses? Why would you think that? Claire asked, sitting there trying to figure out what Pat was saying. What do you mean only a guy who already is wearing dresses? Pat asked now as confused as Claire was. Sheriff found your clothes in the car, honey. Your girl clothes and, to his credit, he simply wanted you to be comfortable. You know, you as you? Actually, it says a lot for the man, Claire said with a touch of admiration in her voice. But he made me wear these things, Pat said. But those are your things, Claire said, confused. These aren't my clothes, Pat said, trying to figure out why Claire didn't know that. He found them in your car, Claire said. My sister's car. I told him my clothes were in the car and this is what he brought me? Pat said, and then added, and he made me pick things out to wear after my shower. I'm not sure I'm getting any of this. Are you a transsexual or not? Claire asked. Transsexual? Transsexual. No. Why? Pat asked. Crossdresser then, Claire asked. No. Never. Well, almost never. At least not since Halloween, Pat said. So where did the clothes come from? Claire asked. Not sure? Thought they belonged to the town or something. They might be my sister's or maybe one of her friends. They are definitely not mine, Pat said. Why didn't you say something to the sheriff then? Claire asked. I did or tried to, but then he got mad and I got scared so I kept my mouth shut, Pat said. So you don't really want to be a girl then? Claire asked. Me? A girl? No. I mean, not like you're thinking, Pat said. Claire sat there a little stunned as the realization of what was unfolding unfolded. She took up her cell phone, flipped it open and dialed the sheriff's office. Potts was at home as the call to the county phone was forwarded to his home phone. Chapter 11. Sheriff Potts. Potts answered. Sheriff, Claire. Listen, there was a brown duffel bag in the back seat of that boy's car. He says it had his clothes. His boy clothes were in that bag. Where did that pink bag come from? Claire said. There was no brown bag. No bag at all in the car. Found that pink bag in the trunk with the makeup? Why? Sheriff Potts asked. Sheriff, that boy Pat doesn't wear girls' clothes. At least not before this. I think there's been a mistake made. Could anyone by chance have taken that other bag of clothes? Claire asked. Mistake? What sort of mistake? Sheriff Potts asked. This boy we've dolled up to look like a girl. It's all a big mistake. He doesn't dress like a girl. I mean, those were not his clothes in the car, Claire said and added, and he said he tried to tell you. He didn't say they were not his clothes. Wait a second, okay, he did say those were not his clothes? I thought he was just too embarrassed to admit they were his. You telling me he doesn't wear girls' clothes and doesn't want to be a girl, Potts said in shock. That's the gist of it, Claire said. Well, I'll be damned, Potts said. This is wild. So what about his clothes? Claire asked. Moss, Sheriff Potts whispered in anger and added, where you at? Millie's. We're having dinner, Claire said smiling. Let me call you back, Sheriff Potts said. So what is happening? Pat asked as Claire closed her cell phone. Sheriff wants to check on something, Claire said and went silent. It was 3 blocks to Frank's automotive and 100 feet to Frank's house. Where's Moss? Sheriff Potts asked. Moss? What's he done now? Frank asked, assuming the worst. Took that boy's clothes from his car, Sheriff Potts said. Moss, Frank hollered, twisting slightly so he was facing the upstairs. Yes, Pa, Moss said, coming out of his room. Sheriff Potts says you took that boy's bag out of his car, Frank asked. No, sir. There was no bag, Moss said. Where did you get that shirt? Sheriff Potts asked. It was a T-shirt with a collage name on it. Moss hadn't finished high school. This old thing, Moss said, feeling dumb now that he realized he picked a shirt with something written on it. Get down here, Moss's father Frank said. Moss came down slowly and stood near before anyone spoke. Moss, you got about 5 minutes to come up with that bag and everything that was in it. I have enough evidence to get a warrant right now, and I'm not going anywhere till that warrant or that bag turns up. If you get that bag before the warrant, it's a misdemeanor. If I find that bag on a warrant, I'm charging you with a felony, Sheriff Potts said, seething. All right. All right, Moss said, holding both hands up in frustration. He ducked his father's swipe near his head as he moved out of range of his father's hand. Now, Sheriff Potts said. Yes, sir, Moss said, turning for his room. It was only a couple of minutes before he returned, and in his hand was the bag. The jeans and t-shirt Moss was wearing were also in the bag now. Consider yourself under house arrest, Moss. I'll be back to book you in the morning, Sheriff Potts said. Yes, sir, Moss said. Sheriff opened his cell phone with his free hand and dialed Claire's cell phone number. Hello, Claire said. Claire. I've got that boy's bag. Moss took it when he picked up his car, Sheriff Potts said. So it's true then, Claire said, looking at Pat. True enough. Now what? Sheriff Potts asked. This was getting out of his league. We've got to get this information to the judge, Claire said. I'm calling her next. I'll call you from there. The boy with you? Sheriff Potts asked. Yes. We're about to eat. Can you meet us here? Claire asked. We can and we will, Sheriff Potts said. Claire asked Lily to set them up at the back table. They were going to need more chairs. It was larger and quieter as she and Pat moved. They'd been served by the time Judge Cartman and Sheriff Potts showed up. Lily meanwhile brought both the dinners special for that night. Pat and Claire stopped eating when the sheriff and judge walked towards the table. Chapter 12. Just coffee, Lily, Judge Cartman said when Lily came up with menus. Me too, Sheriff Potts added. This has got to be about the weirdest thing I've ever seen happen, Judge Cartman said, sitting down at the table. She had not seen Pat since her chambers and was shocked the instant she had walked into the restaurant when she recognized the dress at least. You can say that again, Sheriff Potts noted, also looking at the boy in amazement. Potts as well had not seen Pat since his transformation. If he didn't want to be a girl and look like that, the sheriff mused in silence. So, obviously it's been a wild and very odd set of circumstances, and if I can find any fault with this, it's in the lack of communications or those assumptions we've all been making. Of course you've got the right to file charges, but I'm not sure what those would be without thinking about it some, Judge Cartman said. Pat sat there quietly, trying not to laugh since no one else was. It suddenly had to be the funniest thing that had ever happened to him, and yet there was also a twinge of something else tugging at him as well. He'd gotten his meal and had begun to eat as if he dressed like this all the time. Feeling odd was still there, but getting away with how he looked was there as well. Of course I'm finding you not guilty of all of the charges and releasing you as of right now, Judge Comer said. I've called Frank and your car is going to be sitting in front of my office. You can leave any time you want. Son, I'm not sure what to say other than I'm sorry, Sheriff Potts noted with a shake of his head. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm still hungry and our food is getting cold. Why don't we finish dinner then figure out what to do about this, Claire said as she cut into her chicken fried steak. Pat lost it then. It started with a snicker, then another that the napkin covered before he began laughing. His laughter grew and Claire, realizing why he was laughing, joined in. Judge Cartman, after looking confused for a minute, followed with the sheriff joining in then. Others in the restaurant watched as the four, for some amount of time, lost control of themselves. Lily brought both the sheriff and judge the same special as things began to calm a bit. You look amazing though, you've got to admit that, Judge Cartman said. I'll say, Sheriff Potts said. Thanks, I think, but it's Claire's fault, Pat said. Guilty as charged, Claire said, patting Pat's hand and smiling at Pat as she did so. It was decided that Pat's car would go in front of Claire's place and the sheriff would put the bag with his wallet and traveler's checks in the trunk with Pat's clothes. Pat's original clothes would be brought to Claire's place for Pat to change. Claire had convinced Pat to stay the night and get an early start in the morning. Pat's keys would go into Claire's mail slot at the shop and did after the sheriff called Frank, giving him instructions to do so. Claire suggested fixing Pat's nails before he changed clothes to leave. There were more apologies and Pat had no charges he wanted to make, and that was pretty much that as he and Claire sat eating their pie and snickering on occasion. It was Claire's look that made Pat ask over it. Pat and Claire were alone when dessert came. Just wondering is all. Of course it's none of my business, but I get a sense of you that suggests this isn't your first time, even counting Halloween, that you've done this sort of thing, Claire said, patting Pat's hand. Pat could have easily lied then. He almost did, but it was something about Claire that made him hesitate and consider what he was going to say next. Isn't. I mean, yes, I've done this before and not just for Halloween, Pat said, blushing. He felt comfortable around this woman and added, How did you? How did I know? Claire asked. Yes, Pat answered. Honey, you were simply too happy this way. Any other boy would be beside himself dressed the way you are. Took to it like a duck to water. Look at you. I mean, no offense, but you are adorable and far too at ease with this. I sensed you were enjoying it right from the moment I met you, Claire said. I guess I was enjoying it a little, not at first, mind you, but later. In your shop for sure. No, make that I was enjoying it a lot. Always wondered what it would be like to go out dressed as a girl. Not sure I'd have picked these circumstances, but when I realized that I'd be staying with you and no longer had to worry about the sheriff, it got kind of interesting, Pat said. Well, tomorrow's Saturday, Claire said. Saturday? Pat asked, not sure what Claire meant by that. Thing is, the damage is already done, or rather the stage is already set for you to be who you are right now. No real reason you got to jump in that car of yours and leave just yet. No reason for you to change either. At least not right away. Could spend tonight considering it, and some of tomorrow enjoying it, Claire said, making it clear it was an offer of sorts. I'm not sure I could, Pat said, but wanting desperately to do just what Claire suggested. Bet you could if you stopped thinking about all of the hang-ups and what a yes gets you. In fact, you could simply continue with your sentence, Claire said, patting his hand. You are right about that, I suppose. Mostly it's worrying over what everyone else is thinking, Pat said, feeling slightly giddy from her soft warm hand now resting on his. Everyone else is thinking you're a girl, honey, Claire said as she added, or at least you want to be. Wouldn't mind a few more hours of this, Pat said wistfully. Up to today it had been a few of his sister's things hidden in the house. Chapter 13. Do you like to dance? Claire asked. I guess so, why? Pat asked. Got the Grange Square dance tomorrow night, Claire said. No. I couldn't. I mean, thanks, but no thanks. I wouldn't be comfortable around a bunch of guys. Not like this, Pat said. Honey, it's not the local Grange, but another one I'm thinking of, and one that would be a nice fit for a boy that likes dressing as a girl. A lot of the boys that go to this one like dressing as girls, Claire said. I'm not sure I follow that, Pat said, confused. Honey, it's a gay club and our local hangout for a couple of dozen cross-dresses and a few transsexuals. We square dance once a month. Lots of fun. In fact, I'm guessing that right now, if I asked, Lily would love to partner up with you, Claire said. Lily? Pat asked. Lily is gay's sweetheart, and when I'm not chasing her around the house, she's a pretty fair dancer. I'm guessing that she'd be happy to help you come out, as it were, Claire said and added, makes a pretty fair-looking guy when she's in her dude clothes. Pat sat there stunned, slightly ignoring the half-eaten scoop of vanilla ice cream in front of him. He was looking at his nails and again moving his knee under the slip under the table. There was a slight crinkling sound from his diaper as his legs moved. Mind if I faint? Pat asked, feeling slightly giddy. Not at all, I'll just carry you home from here. Going to be easier getting you ready for bed that way, Claire said, laughing. So you're not gay or gay? Pat asked, catching what he thought was a hint from what Claire had just said. Honey, for me, the grass is just as green on both sides of the fence, and right now, you being a boy in a dress, puts you pretty much on both sides of that same fence, Claire said, patting Pat's hand again but leaving hers there after doing so as she added, besides, you've still got diapers left. Hate to let those go unused. What? Pat said as he did start to feel slightly faint. Sorry about that. It's the nurturer in me, I suppose, Claire said. Pat jumped as his cell phone, now in his pink clutch, started to ring. It's my parents, Pat said, looking at the number as he flipped the tiny phone open. Hi, Mom. No, I'm in Millburg. No, that was a mistake. I'm fine. Really, I'm fine. I'm actually having dinner at the moment. You guys having fun? Me too. I know what you mean. Nice to get away. No, really, everything is wonderful right at the moment. Tell Dad not to worry and tell Sis her car is still in one piece. Actually, no, I was going to drive a little more west of where I am, but I've decided to stay here for a couple of days. Love you too, bye, Pat said, flipping his cell phone closed. A couple of more days, Claire asked, smiling. Just until we run out of diapers, Pat said, snickering. He decided to throw caution to the wind given what Claire had just said. Fat chance of that happening, my sweets, Claire said as she took a seductive bite of the ice cream from her small dessert bowl. I've only got 5 left, Pat said, making it sound like a joke but regretting suddenly how few he did have. That's okay, honey. The thing is, little one, I like keeping Lily in cloth most of the time anyway, and since you'll be borrowing her things for the dance tomorrow night, we might just as well borrow a few of her night things as well, Claire said as she added, Precious, you don't mind sleeping in a cloth diaper, do you? I mean, when you finally get to sleep, that is. Pat wanted to say no, but his mouth wasn't working. Postscript, Sheriff Potts woke the 7 men he'd stuffed into the 2 cells, lining them up for the walk to Judge Cartman's court. It was a few less than most Saturday mornings. Judge Cartman, often surly at this time of day, smiled widely as Tim and Tom Badger marched in first. More so when Frank's son Moss walked in behind them. Sheriff Potts had already talked with the judge about Moss's sentence, and the judge had laughed given that the boy had taken and worn Pat's clothes. She'd laughed after the sheriff had noted that since Moss had worn Pat's jeans and t-shirt, he didn't see any reason why Moss couldn't wear Pat's dress as well. Of course, it wasn't one of Pat's dresses, or rather Tracy's clothes, but Moss didn't know that when the judge handed Moss that bag before pointing him to the restroom. It was that or 90 days this time over at County. Moss took the bag with him into the bathroom. Behind Moss and waiting their turn for that same bathroom were the Badger twins under the watchful eye of Sheriff Potts. Since they insisted on acting like babies most of the time, the judge had noted, she didn't see why they couldn't dress as babies. Babies, the judge noted, didn't wear underwear, handing each boy a disposable diaper after their plea of guilty for being drunk and disorderly. Meanwhile, Pat was turning over sleepily in Claire's bed after waking to the aroma of bacon cooking. Pat had no idea that a cloth diaper under those adult-size rumba panties could feel the way it did. Nor did Pat know there were adults who wore diapers to bed for the sheer pleasure of it. At least not until Claire slid the baby dress of Lily's up to slip that diaper under him. Pat, stretching fitfully, was humming the tune dueling banjos from the original soundtrack of Deliverance. He moved slightly, searching for the pacifier Claire had teased into his mouth last night. That pacifier appeared from Claire's apron right after he and Lily were given their baby bath.